What is life? Why am I here? How is it all connected, and how am I going to navigate this beautiful but crazy journey? I am Sylvia and welcome to the Soul Sunshine podcast. Today I'm talking to Sara de Clercq. As a professional trained neuro-linguistic and integral development coach, poet, artist and speaker, Sara holds space for people to access, strengthen and sequence the resources that are already present inside of every individual. People engage Sara for the expansive mind-opening awareness she brings into the coaching process. Her warm, down-to-earth and genuine spirit makes her one of a kind, and I'm super excited to be sitting down with her today. Welcome to the Soul Sunshine podcast, Sara. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm really excited too, and I'm really excited what we're going to dive into today. It's a lovely Sunday. It's beautiful weather here. I don't know how it is at your place, but yeah, I'm really excited. This day is going to be amazing, and thank you so much for having me.
No worries. I'm super excited that you're here. And when I'm saying you're here, we're actually having a Zoom conversation today because you have just recently moved from Bondi up to Byron Bay in northern New South Wales. And I have to say I'm super envious because I do love Byron and I would love to be sitting up there with you today having this conversation. But yeah, I'll come and visit you next time when I'm up there, I guess.
For sure. You can always come along and have a place. We have an extra bedroom, so you can always come along and have a place to stay. And
Perfect. Sounds good. But yeah, no, the weather is beautiful here in Sydney today as well. It's a really lovely morning. And yeah, great morning to have a really deep and meaningful conversation, I would say. So what are we going to be talking today about? We are pretty much going to be diving into self-development, and especially from an integral theory and integral development point of view. Why we also think that it is really important to do that, and how everyone can start living their own truth. I think for us, it's really important to look at consciousness, to talk about that from an individual level as well as from a holistic and collective level, and how we can all overcome that heteronomy that's existing, and how I guess seeing our own drivers that shape our reality can change our story, and how that can help us moving forward. So, Sara, I was reflecting on how we actually met. And we met about a year ago through Digital Storytellers. I was working with your partner Dan on last year's Yes and Festival. And I remember being down in Bondi for a walk one day with George and the boys. And suddenly I just hear this Sylvia, and I'm looking over and it was Dan and you sitting on the grass. And it was funny because it all went through COVID, the whole Yes and Festival that you guys planned last year. I've only met Dan over Zoom as well. So I think you spotted our kids and Dan was like, oh, that's actually Sylvia. And that's when we met for the first time. Yeah, face to face, I guess.
I remember that day, Dan and I had this little routine in Bondi where we would, in the weekends, always sit next to the beach. Although it was very cold, I think, at that stage. But we would do it anyway. And we would just watch everyone walking by. It's such an interesting thing to do. And indeed, like I spotted your kids and then there you were. So yeah, that was really fun. And in terms of COVID last year with Yes and, it was pretty crazy how we did that actually. And I remember Digital Storytellers being a huge support to us at that time. So yeah, it's really fun to sit here together again.
I know. And we're going to be talking about the festival a little bit later on. And yeah, you guys are doing an amazing job there. But before we get to that, let's start at the beginning and let's just jump into this conversation. Sara, if you can maybe just start with telling us a little bit about your background. You know, was self-development something that has always really sparked an interest in you, or is this something that has kind of developed over time?
Yeah, so I'm originally from the Netherlands. So I was born and raised in the Netherlands. We lived in The Hague, that's a big city in the Netherlands. And then we moved to the countryside when I was about 9 years old. So I lived on the countryside for a long time and with a lovely family, like really amazing family. And my interest for human development, it's hard to even say where that really started because I think it actually started really, really young, even on a sort of a unconscious level. I remember coming home from school pretty tired always. And my mom would ask the teacher, why is Sara always so tired? Every time she comes from school, she's tired actually. And the teacher was saying, well, that doesn't surprise me because she's taking everything and everyone 100% in all the time. So like I was looking outside and I was observing a lot and just exploring a lot. And looking at human behavior from a very young age, I think, whilst I didn't really realize that I was doing that at that stage. But I think that's where it actually sort of started, my curiosity for the world, first and foremost, and for human behavior in that, and how people have different perspectives and different realities and how that forms their behavior. Not that I rationally understood that in that way at that age, but it was definitely curiosity always. And my mom being a yoga teacher, so raised with body scans when I was maybe 5 years old, going to bed, and we would do body scans before going to bed. Body scan is, just for people that don't know what that is, it's like a very simple meditation that you just feel different parts of your body, basically, and bring your attention and awareness to different parts of your body. And I think that's where it started from a very young age. And then the interest grew and grew and grew. But I also think I forgot it at some point a bit. I was in high school and I was just doing all the stuff that high school girls do. And then I went to uni doing all the stuff that uni girls do, with a lot of partying and fun stuff as well, and holidays with friends and whatever else was involved in it. But studying marketing and business communication and graphic design, which is a combination of all those things, which is also very much about human behavior and how to influence human behavior in such a way. So that was what attracted me to that study. So yeah, I can see it in that a bit, the interest for human behavior in that sense, and also the interest in how color and text and writing and filmmaking and how all of that shapes a story for people. That got my attention. So that's why I studied that. And in the meantime, when I was 14 years old, I was scouted as a model, and I did modeling from the age of 14, which is pretty young. So from the age of 14, I also started traveling by myself. It started in Europe, in Amsterdam, Paris, and then London. And then when I was a little bit older, when I was about 18, 19, I also went to Dubai and Morocco and Singapore for a while. So I went to different places over the world, and I think that really broadened my perspective on different cultures and how people think differently in different environments and cultures. And it just opened my eyes up to how living is so different in different countries. And it's funny when I look at it back now, because I think that actually allowed me at quite a young age to see the world from a worldview perspective, which from a stages and development point of view is something that people maybe, if ever, develop when they're around 20 years old or something. So when they really start to see that the world is all connected and we're all on the same planet and so on. If ever, and for some people it doesn't happen because they're maybe not exposed to different cultures, or it's just not in their life journey in such a way. But yeah, I think that really allowed me to open up my eyes and just explore different cultures. And in the modeling industry, it was also, I had lots of fun, and I learned so much through that, and learned so much through being by myself a lot as well, because I was by myself a lot. So I needed to figure out my own way, really. So with that, I learned how to do things myself, really, and also listen to my own intuition. And yeah, I think all of that together, like if I really look at sort of a global overview of my life path and sort of like what are the bits and pieces that are the differences that have made the difference, that's probably the best sort of summary.
So there's a few things that really jump out for me there. The first thing that you said, which I found quite interesting, is that you, from a very early age on, you had that interest and you were doing the things probably more subconsciously than consciously. You know, you were looking at people, you were observing things, and that your mom was also a yoga teacher. She was probably very early on then in that craze around yoga and, you know, mindfulness. And that reminds me of nature versus nurture as well. And it almost feels like you've been given it as a human generally, that interest in human beings, but then you've also been nurtured into that throughout your family, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, for sure. I think my mom played a huge role in my overall development, and in combination with the travel, I think all the different things, but my mom has definitely from a very young age sort of like planted the seed in such a way. So yeah, along the way, sort of forgot that a bit. And then now the circle comes back around a bit, which is quite funny to see. Yeah.
Yeah. You've also talked about the stages of consciousness, and I do want to go into that a little bit later on with you. We're going to be talking about that in more detail. But right now, what I would like to talk about a little bit more is you said you started modeling when you were 14, which is quite early on as well. And you've started traveling by yourself, traveled all over Europe, then outside of Europe. And you said you've really enjoyed it. You've, taken a lot of positive things out of that. But I guess the question for me was, what were some of the challenges that you came across while you were doing that work, and how has that then potentially also shaped your life path forward into the direction that you're in now?
Yeah, so overall, I have a very positive view on it, very insightful process it has been. And if we look at some of the challenges, first thing that comes up is the fact to be alone, traveling, figuring out my own way, and then sometimes being in environments where, like, I got told different things. There was very positive reinforcement, but also negative reinforcement, and to balance that both and to see it both as, okay, this is someone's opinion or someone else's perspective or point of view, and how do I feel about that, or what is my perspective on that? So it really allowed me, I think, to discern between what is true for me and what is true for someone else. The challenges were definitely there. Like when there was something a little bit more, let's say, negative, I can't even tell you how many times I've been rejected on castings and on things. I don't know, many times, a lot of times. So it's to really take everything with a grain of salt. But that wasn't always easy to do that from the beginning. So in that times I started to meditate more. In the beginning, it was really about just connecting with myself and not letting other things outside of me influence how I feel and think and so on. And it was actually very simple and basic at that time, which is now, if we speak about it, about, I think 5 years ago, because that's when I started modeling full time. So that's where it became a bit more challenging, because before that I was always with 1 foot in modeling industry, but I was also with 1 foot at home and 1 foot with the family and 1 foot with my friends. So that balanced me out in that sense a bit. But then I started modeling full time, and I really started to notice how I could be pulled into that world very quickly, and how, although I was quite down to earth and quite, okay, whatever, but still it happened, right? So it's a very tricky thing. And I realized how quick that pull happens, and the pull just simply meaning being really aware of how I was looking all the time and very self-conscious about that. And of course, that is what the industry is about. So it isn't that surprising. But if it's that constant focus on that, it can become quite unhealthy. So that was, like negative self-talk at times as well. And it really started me to meditate more and also read into self-development books more. Like, I think one of the books that really, really, really resonated with me then was The Obstacle is the Way. I don't know if you've heard about that. It really speaks to how challenging times are actually there to grow you up as a human being and grow through that and work through that. And I started seeing what I would prior see as a negative experience. I started it seeing almost like as an opportunity. So it really started to change my reality on what is negative, what is positive. Now I know that that doesn't really exist, because it's both an expression of dualism. But at that stage, it really supported me. So I started reading different books. I also went into NLP, neuro-linguistic program, because I see a lot of power and potential in NLP, because NLP shows us how we make meaning and how we shape our reality, whilst integral theory, for example, shows us what is possible on an impersonal and an interpersonal, so a global level. But NLP shows us how we can do that as individuals and what is happening in our filters and so on. So I really saw the power of NLP. But books and meditation was the way to go for me there. And it was because of those challenges that sort of led me to that again, sort of back again, actually, really, because it was already happening with my family, with my mom, but then it came back again, stronger than what before. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I personally haven't heard of the book, but I should read it, because I talk about that a lot. And it's the whole, I'm not saying that you always have to go through really challenging times in order to grow as a person. It's not just like this is the only way in order to grow. But a lot of the time, that's what it comes with, right? It's those experiences that you're making where you have to almost grow outside of yourself in order to get through it. And then as part of that, you grow as a person and you're like on the next level moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. Totally agree. And it's a completely different experience when someone feels like life is shit and nothing is working out versus, oh, okay, this is another opportunity to grow. That's just a completely different perspective in that moment. And that can really make a huge difference in how someone approaches a situation like that or, yeah, a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with, having a bad day every now and then, but I think it is important to then get out of that and be like, okay, this is maybe not ideal and this is not what I've envisaged, but what can I learn out of it and what are the opportunities that I can take out of it in order to, make a change in my life at the end of the day.
Yeah, what it reminds me of is a certain level of resilience as well. Like resilience to, yeah, of course, like there's always going to be moments of what we can see as challenging or shitty day or whatever. But when someone has the capacity to, whether that is on the same day or a day later or a week later, it's going to make a difference versus meta-stating, which is a state upon a state, into a state of depression. Because that can happen too if it's constantly repeated because someone isn't able to sort of objectify themselves from that and then see it as an opportunity. It will go somewhere, like it's going to either go left or right. Not that simple, but it's going to go somewhere, that thought or that state. So yeah, it's really different how we deal with things, how things are experienced.
But how would you, just to stay on this for a little bit, how would you say that people can learn to get out of that? How can they learn to see something as opportunities rather than challenges? I think it's really interesting what you said there in terms of, you might be in there for a day or for 2 days and then you get out of it again. And I've experienced that in my own self-development over the years, like when I used to get into a bad state, it sometimes took me forever to get out of it. While now, over the last 10 years or so, I've learned so many tools and I've done so much practice, I guess, in terms of what do I need to do in order to get myself out of it again if I'm not feeling great, and the more you practice it and the more you learn it, the faster, I guess, you can do that again. But what would you tell people to do in those scenarios and how can they really learn and figure out to make those times shorter, I guess? Because life is not always going to be, sunshine and rainbows. There is going to be tough times. So what are the things that people can do in order to get out of that faster?
Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with what you're saying in terms of like it goes faster over time. So that comes with experience and it comes with an habituate a bit because it is a habit. And if the habit is to stay in that emotion or if the habit is to sort of take yourself out of it, then that's the new habit kind of thing. And it's just the pathways in the brain are differently wired. And that happens over time. So yeah, what you're saying, and that's my perspective is, I think, bang on in that sense. Another thing that I would really easily do is bring someone to their body because no one ever had a feeling without a thought in between. The feeling is not just coming out of nowhere. There's always a thought in between. So if the feeling is depression, if someone comes to me with a feeling of, I feel stressed, I feel anxious, I feel depressed, I feel nervous, I feel cheerful, I feel excited, whatever the feeling is, that is actually not a feeling. That is a thinking. What is the actual feeling that is coming with that? And where do you feel that in your body is where we then go. And it's like, oh, I feel that in my chest, or I feel that in my gut, or I feel that here. And it's kind of like spinning. Okay, what is the rest of the sensation of that feeling? It's spinning, it's turning, it's maybe warm or it's cold or it's contracting or going outwards or inwards. And instead of giving it a label, because those labels are mind labels and they're not actually feelings. So if people can start connecting with their actual feelings as a sensation rather than a label with that feeling, it really opens up the space to, first and foremost, sit with the actual sensation and then not label it, basically. And that's how you undo the patterning of conditioning of habituated labeling, really, because we're meaning-making machines. We're constantly labeling, like, a glass of water. Is it a glass of water? The only way I know that is because I've learned that somewhere, right? It goes that simple at times as well. And how do I know that something is bad or good? It's only because I've learned it and associated with certain things at times. So it's really what is actually happening. And if it's an overwhelming feeling like anxiety, depression, whatever it is, then what is the actual sensation rather than the thinking?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it also reminds me of the fact that when those feelings do come up, I think as humans, when they are uncomfortable feelings, we are very quick to want to push them away and to not want to look at them and to kind of be like, I'll deal with that later. That doesn't really have space right now in my life. Meanwhile, it is really important to go into that feeling and to look where it's coming from and to look what's, like you said, the thinking that's associated with it. Because if you're not looking at it now and if you're not working through it when it comes up, it might go away, but it will most certainly pop up at some other point again.
Yeah, it will follow us like a bad smell if we're not going to look at it. And even for the people that might not be experiencing extreme levels of anxiety or overwhelm, there is things that are probably unresourceful. Every human is experiencing it to some degree. And yes, there's different degrees on how people experience it, but there's always opportunity for self-work in that sense. Even if it's a tiny bit of frustration because I need to put the bin outside, whatever it is, right? Even that little tiny bit of frustration is not necessary. And this is also in the coaching process, right? It starts with the sort of bigger events, so to speak, like the anxiety or the stress around work or the really angry moments with the wife or whatever it is. Like it starts with those sort of bigger events and then we go into the smaller events. But the first thing, and I really like that you're saying that, is taking the moment to stop and be with it, because it is going to follow and it's going to amplify as well if there's not going to be looked at. And that's why when people later on in the coaching process, it is the tiny little things, because they don't have the opportunity to grow anymore into bigger things because it is already addressed when they're tiny. So therefore, coaching or any form of development, whether that is through yoga, however form someone likes to do that, it is for everyone, really, because everyone is experiencing certain thoughts and feelings that are not always resourceful. And first and foremost, it's the permission to stop and sit with it and look at it. And then from there we go. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think self-development is something that every single human person on this planet needs. Most of them without realizing it. And I always have a little bit of a giggle inside when I hear people going like, oh, I don't need that, or I'm fine, or I don't have anything to work on, because everybody has something to work on, you know, and you don't need to have a really screwed up childhood or, I don't know, like a really dramatic experience in your youth in order to need self-development or in order to want to be working on yourself. I find it beautiful the way you said it. It's the little things that you can change in order to change yourself as a person in a big way. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, and it is a process. So there has to be a certain readiness for a person to actually start looking at it. Because for some people, it might be too fearful or too overwhelming, or just simply the idea of what you said of like, oh, I don't need it. There's nothing happening for me. Well, I know, and maybe you know, that that's not true. But is the person ready for their own truth, for their own realization? And if they are, they will. And if they're not, then they will not. And that is also okay. That is also very much allowed in that sense.
Exactly. And it does start with awareness. And I think it's with anything that's involving change, a person needs to be ready themselves. You can never push somebody into doing something, you know. You can't do it with self-development. You can't push somebody into doing exercise or eating healthier or drinking less. It's always the person that needs to want to make the change in order for the change to happen. Because otherwise it's just not going to work out. And it's like you said, it's also okay. And it might just be at a later point that they are going to be ready for that, or they might never want to do it, which is, you know, maybe then that's their path in this life.
And it brings us actually to a beautiful point in the sense of if we look at climate change and COVID and the bigger events happening in the world right now, we can touch on this later with the stages of development. But what we are probably going to see as a moving into green level of consciousness is how we call it, is pluralistic. And it is pluralistic is very much for the planet, and it is very much for save the animals and save the world, which is beautiful. But pluralistic can be also very mean green, which is what about, I'd say 30% of the world population is pluralistic, and about maybe 20% or 15% in Australia. And it's going to be important to, when that move is going to happen from orange, which is rational reasoning, scientific, materialistic perspective, to pluralistic, it's going to be important to let everyone have their own process and their own path in that and their own experience in that, because there is no right and wrong way. And what mean green pluralistic can do is we all need to do this. And that is the shift that's going to happen probably more worldwide as well, what we're going to see in consciousness. And yeah, we really want to move to integral tail perspective as a planetary sort of ecosystem, as a human race, as a consciousness on this planet. And from tail, there is actually the real direct experience of my perspective is true, but partial. Similar to everyone else's perspective is true, but partial. And that means everyone has the right to their own perspective and everyone has the right to their own points of view. And how can we listen to the signal? Because there's always signal in every perspective. How can we listen to the signal behind the noise? No matter how much noise there might be involved. And for some people, there's a little bit more noise involved. And with other people, there's a little bit less noise involved. There's always going to be signal in it. So how can we listen to the signal behind that, behind the noise? Yeah.
That's really interesting. And maybe let's backtrack on that a little bit now, because we actually ended up at the stages of consciousness now already, which is great. But in order to go into that a little bit in more detail, we need to talk about what they are first. So if you can just give us a little bit of an overview of the stages of consciousness. So they are part of the integral development work that you do. Maybe just give us a little bit of an overview what they are, what we're looking at here, how the whole integral development work works, what the strategies behind that are, and then looking at the stages of consciousness so that we get a little bit of an overview before we can then dive deeper into some of those layers which you've already just talked about, which is super interesting, I think, and which can be unpacked a little bit more even.
Yeah, for sure. So integral theory is a human consciousness, human potential framework designed by Ken Wilber. And it's actually from the Equal model. And the Equal model is a combination and a merge of Buddhism, Sufism, Western psychology, also Christianity, all the different religious, all the different scientific perspectives, and all the different Western psychology perspectives. And Ken Wilber put it into one framework, basically into one model, which is the Equal model. And in the Equal model, there are 5 main sort of components. One of them is the stages of development. Another one is the states. So that are states of consciousness, states of waking up, which can be gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. Then there's personality types with the Enneagram personality, and it's personality profiling. And the difference with this personality type is that it is designed to box you out rather than to box you in. And so the personality profiling is really to show people what their drivers and their preference and their values and their belief systems are and so on. But it's not to stay in that. It's actually to box you out of that. So box you free from your personality, from the ego construct. And then we've got lines of intelligence. So there are about 200 different lines of intelligence, I believe. And yeah, he describes the different lines of intelligence with the cognitive line as the leading line to the other lines. And I believe he takes 6 lines out of that are most sort of prominent in human development, in human growth, which is cognitive development, also moral development, and also spiritual development. And then there are the 4 quadrants, which is also a very, very important part of the integral model. And it's the 4 quadrants of the reality. And it's basically speaks to what different perspectives and elements are at play in each and every moment. So the 4 quadrants speaks to the I space, which is the individual subjective experience, which is my feelings, my thoughts, my emotions, my thinking, my perspective, whatever it is. And there's the we space, which is you and myself. So the intersubjective experience speaks to what is going on between us two, basically. Then there's the it space, which is the more materialistic perspective in the doing. So shit needs to be done. That is more the it space, more science there. Also the cells in the body biology that lives in the it space. And then there's the it space, which is all the systems and everything working together. The systems at large, which is like different cities being connected, all the interconnectedness of everything, basically. And those different elements, those 4 quadrants are always at play in every moment. Now, and now. And an integral, holistic perspective is being able to see those 4 different quadrants in each and every moment. And being able to play and flex and flow between those different quadrants and speak to those with different people. So if someone is speaking in a coaching session to me and that person is saying, yeah, you know how you feel this and you feel that, they're speaking from an it perspective rather than from their actual. And what they mean is I feel this and I feel that, but they're not saying that. They're saying you. So I can hear different language and I can see where people are speaking from through different perspectives. So the integral model in that sense is an incredibly in-depth model for coaches and for speakers, facilitators, whoever's in this work. It allows for really deep understanding where people are coming from and where they're speaking from, and therefore also lead them to their and facilitate them to their potential. And just to come back to your question, the stages of development is a very important part of that. And the stages is very simply put where people are looking through. States can be experienced in meditation or in yoga or in breath work or just simply walking on the street. But, like a state is very obvious for someone. It's obvious that someone is in a state experience. It can also be experienced through psychedelics or, right? Like it's obvious that someone is in a state experience and it's what we look at. But a stage is what we look through. So an individual might not be aware of what stage they are at unless they have someone else skilled in this work to reflect that back to them and also into their own self-inquiry and honesty and so on with themselves around that to see where they're sitting on this model. And a very, very important thing about this model is it is a holarchy. It's not a hierarchy. So no stage or perspective is better than the other one. It's simply more holistic and it takes more into consideration. And also it speaks to how far are we distracted into the stages rather than we're going to grow and develop ourselves into some better or more holistic human being. We are already holistic. It just depends on how far we are distracted into the different stages.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's like you said, it's super holistic and super in-depth. And there's so many things that are falling into that model of coaching, I guess. And I, for example, I had no idea that the Enneagram was part of the integral theory as well, because I've done a lot of personality profiling work over the years and have looked at lots of different things. And Enneagram is one of the things that we're also using at work. So I had no idea that that's part of the same system, which is awesome. So in order to get back to the stages of consciousness now, you've already talked about it a little bit before, but when we're looking at the different stages that are there, and when we're looking at the world right now, like you said, with COVID, climate change, it feels like there is a lot of stuff happening, particularly right now. Last year we had the Black Lives Matter movement, and now in Australia we've got the government blowing up with all the sex scandals that are happening. America has gotten a new president. Trump got voted out. It feels like there is so much happening at the moment in the world. And quite a lot of really big things, and big changes that are taking place. So looking at all the things that are happening, or like just taking that as a holistic example, I guess, how would you classify that within those stages of consciousness? Where are we as a world? Where do you think we can get to, or where do we strive that we actually would love to be in a perfect world scenario?
Yeah, good question. I definitely think that everything that is happening at this moment in the world is an expression of where people are looking from. So an expression of people's consciousness. And so Black Lives Matter, for example, is an expression of the green postmodern level perspective, because Black lives have always mattered. They've always mattered. And all of a sudden that comes out as a expression of people's perspectives. So everything that we're seeing in the world in that sense, from politics to schooling systems to things like Black Lives Matter, every movement and thing that we see in the world is an expression of the stage of consciousness that people are looking from. So in terms of what's happening, I definitely think that we're going through some sort of collective clearing and collective awakening in that sense. And that's going to be really different for everyone, because people are looking from different perspectives and are experiencing different things in their lives. So for some people, it might be more a move from orange rational reasoning, which is more scientific perspective, into green, which can feel like a bit of, from the corporate world, all of a sudden not really being interested in that anymore and moving more to environmental actions and behaviors and so on, and standing up for the environment. And then from amber worldview to orange, that is more from a rules, and it's all about discipline, and it's in faith in God and so on. And from amber to orange is all of a sudden there's no God anymore and there is science. So it's going to be different for different people because we're not all looking from the same perspective. Our gravity of center is not at the same stage in that sense, but I definitely think there's a collective awakening happening. And what I think is also happening is that, especially if we look at orange scientific perspective to moving to green postmodern perspective, what is, I think, happening there is that the systems that are at play, which is the government system, the banking system, the system of schools, the system of work, and so on, is not aligned anymore with people's values. And that's where disturbance happens, because all of a sudden people see that as something that is actually not that useful, or something that's actually not aligned with their values, aligned with their beliefs, aligned with the way they think that the world should be different or could be different. And therefore there is a disruption happening there. And that's what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, but also we can see more in the millennial generation, which I'm very much a part of, is more of a, like, why would I do that? Why would I work in a company from 9 to 5? It is very much a perspective that is more going towards green, postmodern, pluralistic perspective, which is like, what you might hear someone say, if we're moving into green is, I want to make something out of my life. And I'm going to choose what to do, and I'm going to do it myself, because when I'm old, I want to look back at my life and I want to make sure it's been awesome. And that is a move towards green level perspective. And that is all in first tier. And what that means, first tier, it all means that they don't agree with each other. So that's where the disturbance is coming from. So they don't agree and can't see each other's point of view, because they see their own view as the one and only way, so to speak, to look at the world. And they can be very strong. And there's a lot of care behind that. Sure, there's a lot of care behind it, right? So if someone is standing up for the whales, for the environment, there's a lot of care behind that. They can't see that someone else is simply not able to see that that is important. Someone is not seeing that. So we can't point at that and say, you need to see this. Someone can't see that. So what is definitely going to be a revolutionary shift, and at this stage there is about 5% maybe of the world population at second tier, but they say at 10% there's a tipping point, and then most of the people will move to the second tier. And it is still integrated perspective. And the main difference, like I mentioned before, is that someone can see this is my perspective, and everyone has the right to have their own perspective, and everyone is at different stages of development. And Till can very much see the holistic, interwoven interconnectedness of everything, and also how human development goes through stages. And also Till knows that they're one step on the way. Their perspective is not the right perspective necessarily. So Till knows that they're in a process kind of thing, whilst the prior stages think that their perspective is definitely true. And yeah, that's going to be an interesting move for the world. That's going to be an interesting shift, because people are going to not always see each other's perspective, and it's going to be definitely interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting. So when we're talking about percentages at the moment, you said 5% at the moment you think are in the teal tier, while 95% are still in the first tier. And did you say it takes 10% for the tipping point? Like once 10% are in the teal, that's when people really going to start to shift over?
Yeah. On average, if we look at patterns in the past and how that's been happening in the past, when there's a tipping point from, for example, amber level of consciousness to orange, it's more or less 10%. And then there's a tipping point for people to, most people also move to the gravity of center of their particular country. So for example, Scandinavia is more teal. Scandinavia and some countries in Europe are, the Netherlands, I believe, is probably moving into teal now. There are more teal. So people born in that country are naturally gonna go more towards that perspective, because people around them are looking from that perspective as well, and they're interacting with that people. And this is where waking up and growing up, it's super complex. Like, we can touch on so many things. But in a lot of Asian countries, they're very developed in the waking up realm. So they're very developed in terms of meditation and traditional practices and so on. But they're maybe not so developed in the growing up. And this is growing up. So the stages of consciousness is growing up through human consciousness and through perspectives and what we're looking through. So what we are doing in coaching, and it's going to be a very important revolutionary shift, is the combination of growing up and waking up together, because that combination is going to make the difference in human potential and in our collective consciousness shift as well. Yeah.
I have to get back to that again. So growing up versus waking up. Growing up is the stages of consciousness, and waking up is?
Waking up is a state experience. Waking up speaks more to how we now, for example, we can see each other. This is what we call gross reality. So it's like, it's touchable, it's material. But there's also subtle reality happening here, which is your thoughts and feelings and my thoughts and feelings in here, in this location. And then there's Kolsa, which is sort of beyond that, which is where we can see that we are actually the same thing from an energy sort of perspective in that sense. And then non-dual is just simply, it's all one blob or whatever you want to call it. And waking up is, if someone is experiencing a waking up experience, it is felt like a state experience and a waking up can be out of someone's current perspective, and it can be experienced like that. But what we're doing, because we're combining waking up and growing up, what we're doing is growing up combined with waking up. So combined with meditation, yoga, but also the growing up perspective. So looking at someone's own filters and belief systems and perspectives and seeing that that is true, but it is partial and it's a demi-reality and not 100% real, true reality. Combining those things, if someone is enough like sort of thrown into waking up experience, combined with the growing up work, that becomes a new stage. So then we move from, for example, teal to turquoise or orange to green, because waking up is also being able to see more and more and more of what's happening in the world and more clearly how storied our reality is and how storied our perspectives is and how storied and biased we are. And that is also part of the waking up. So it's really waking up to what is true prior to the conditioning.
From my experience, I always see those things as a bit of a generational thing as well. Do you think when we're looking at the stages of consciousness and the waking up, growing up, do you think there is a big shift with new generations coming through, or is it more like an individual thing and it doesn't necessarily mean, that the younger generation is going to be more conscious or more woken up than the older generation? Like, how do you look at that?
Well, in general, it is evolution. So the younger generation is going to be, in general, higher in their consciousness if they develop themselves in that way. And that is the question, right? We don't know if people are going to develop themselves. And that's going to be an individual journey in that sense. But what we are seeing in society is people are shifting and changing. And the more people are at, let's say, green or teal, the more people will move through that. And then someone new gets born into the world. If we just simply look at an evolutionary perspective, the chances that they are going to move to that level relatively quickly are quite high, because the gravity of center of part of the world or big chunk of the world is already there. So yeah, that's what this model is about. It's an evolutionary model. So yes, it is different in generation, but it doesn't mean that someone who is now, let's say, 60 years old cannot start on this sort of process for themselves or already in it and can have a very high perspective in that sense. So in general, yes. And that's also what we want, because that is how evolution happens. And if our children are going to see exactly the same perspectives that we are, evolution is not happening. They're going to see the world differently. Hopefully that would be a good thing. And it's also an individual journey, but in general, yes.
And I think it's beautiful as well when you're looking back at where you're coming from, when you're looking back to your grandparents and what their belief systems were and the world that they were living in, and then looking at your parents and then coming to yourself. And then, I'm also now looking at my children, going like, I'm having such different opinions and such different mindsets around a lot of things than, my parents or my grandparents had, and my children are then, that's their starting point. They're starting with what I'm thinking right now. And that's what they're going to be building on, the way that I was starting with what my parents were thinking. And that was my starting point where I started building my life,
Yeah. And everyone needs to go through all the stages of development, by the way. So every human being who gets born into this world needs to go through all the stages themselves. But the speed of which that happens is going to be different.
Ah, that's cool. Okay, I didn't realize that.
So if I have in a coaching session, I have someone sitting in front of me, just by having a conversation with that person, and I know that person is, let's say, at red level of consciousness, which is egocentric, I'm not going to throw in a non-dual statement. It's going to disturb someone's world completely. That's not wise for me to do in that stage or in that instant. So it's really looking at where is the person in front of me? Where are they on this model, more or less, what I can see from my perspective, right? Because that is my perspective and it's not necessarily the truth. So what I can see in my perspective and what can I speak to that's going to allow that person to gradually move through their potential to the next stage for them. The goal is not let's get everyone as soon as possible to the, like, yes, that would be a great evolutionary transition, but it's not going to be healthy for every human being. And some people might never grow there because it is not healthy for that person, because people always have a reason for doing things and there's always a positive intention for doing things. And if there is a positive intention behind a certain behavior or belief or value or thing, that's probably going to keep them very, very healthy if they keep believing in that. So if we have someone who believes in God, I, as a coach, would push them into scientific point of view. Or I would mention, because at turquoise, another God starts to come back again, but in a completely different way than the God at traditional amber, which is a completely different kind of God. Like, it's not the man with the beard in the sky or that kind of a God. So in second tier, God comes back again, but in a completely different way. So if I start throwing in that stuff for that person, he's going to interpret it through his own lens. So he's not going to be able to see what is actually being said. So as a developmental coach, as an integral developmental coach, it is the ability to speak to where the person is at and to speak to their next potential. And it's up to them to do something with that or not. Like, it's always the client does the work. I'm not doing the work. The client does the work themselves. So yeah, that's a very important principle as well.
I think that's such a beautiful way to look at that as well, because I think you are right. Like, a lot of the time people are trying to push their opinions and their agendas on you, you know, but this is more like, this is where you are at. I'm picking you up where you are at, and I'm showing you the way forward, and I'm showing you what's possible if you take a step into a new direction. And then it's up to you if you want to take it or not, but it is there for you to take. And that's how you can work your way. Yeah, how you can work your way up the ladder if you would like to. And if you don't, I was thinking of that from like a higher perspective as well. It's like, you know, maybe it's also just not part of someone's journey in this life. Maybe they're just exactly where they need to be, and that's okay, you know?
Absolutely. If we look at past lives and reincarnation and coming back into the life circle, the current perspective on that from here is that someone is going to come back until they reach enlightenment. So this is exactly where they need to be. Everyone is exactly where they need to be in that sense. And people choose their own, and they're going to develop themselves through what is right for them in this lifetime. And that is exactly what is supposed to happen, if you want to say it like that. But yeah. And then the cycle is going to happen again for them until they reach enlightenment. That's the current perspective from here to look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I'm looking at that as well, I guess. It's like, better do our work in this life so we don't have to come back to it anymore. It's not too bad here. We don't have it too bad.
Maybe we can just come back and enjoy it, but we don't have to do the work anymore because we're already, yeah. It's interesting. It's going to be different. Like, let's say when someone dies, when they're at, let's say, turquoise level of consciousness, what the current understanding from that is here is that someone will come back in this lifetime and will grow relatively quickly to that stage of consciousness and then has the potential to move forward again. So that will happen relatively quickly for the person. So therefore, age is really not a thing in this whole process, because some people might be 13 years old and they have a really, really high understanding and high perspective, while someone might be 70 and has no idea what that person is talking about, right? So age is completely out of the picture here, which is kind of a beautiful thing. And it also helps us work through our own conditioning that the older you are, the more wise we are or something, which is not necessarily the truth at all if we look at this model.
Yeah, I like that. It's like anything is possible at any point in your life, you know, if you want to go there. And not so much if you want to go there, because wanting and being able to from really deep within is also different.
Yeah. If it's more like happening for you already, and whilst also taking steps. Like a lot of this is also happening for us. And yes, we're consciously taking action and we're consciously working on ourselves for sure. And we also have always the opportunity to not do that anymore at a stage. Like I can say now, oh no, I don't want to do this anymore and stop doing it, right? And that's going to stagnate my growth and development for sure. But that is always a possibility. And we don't know how life is going to go. So it's also happening for us in that sense. Another really beautiful thing that we are working with Ella, and she's an indigenous woman from here in Byron, and we're working with Yazen with her, and she told us in our last conversation, and she has a beautiful perspective on how actually the oldest people and the youngest people in, let's say, the village or the community, they are seen as the wisest because they're closest to spirit. So they're closest either from, they're just being born kind of thing. So they're closest to earth, and then when they're older, they're going to die at some point, they're going to pass away, and then they're close to spirit as well. So because they're closest to spirit, they're the wisest. That's sort of their perspective. And I thought it was a really beautiful way of looking at that as well.
It is really beautiful. And I actually really agree with that. And having 2 children as well. I remember when my first son was born, and he was a really alert and awake baby. And I remember him looking at me with those big dark blue eyes that he had when he was born. And I remember thinking, you're just looking into my soul. You're just looking through me and you just know everything. He had this really wise aura that kind of surrounded him. And I remember when he looked at me, it was always this, you see every single bit of me. That's always the feeling that I had when he looked at me. And then, they grow up and they become a little bit more childlike. But yeah, I remember when he was born, it was quite magical. It was almost like a little bit spooky, but then just so beautiful as well, because I really felt like he knew it all,
Yeah, and it's beautiful that you said it's definitely been the experience here. The more sort of work is being done on myself here, the more I start looking at babies with like this wonderful, wise creature is sitting there and the way they look at the world. And it's just this immense amount of love that they are and expressing, and that we all are and expressing. There just might be some layers of conditioning on top of that, but for them that hasn't really been happened yet. And it's not to say not to condition, because conditioning is going to happen for everyone, right? Conditioning is going to happen for everyone. It's probably a healthy thing to happen, just depends on what kind of conditioning and to what degree. But yeah, the wisdom in a baby, it's beautiful for sure.
Yeah, it is quite magical, that's for sure. It's really interesting when you're saying with kids and how they don't have a lot of conditioning yet, but at the end of the day, they actually do have a lot of conditioning, even just by having been in your body for 9 months, and have been feeling everything that you are feeling and have been growing inside of you. And I mean, I've done a lot of work over the years for myself. And I remember the coach that I'm working with, he was always like, the more we can get you sorted, the less baggage your children can have when they come into the world, and they're more free and the more, just their own beings they can be, so they can pick up the things that they need along the way, but they don't need to come with all your baggage, I've talked about that actually in my very first podcast, where it's about birthing, and it's like, the more work we can do on ourselves, the more free our children can be born, really, because we can release some of those old traumas and old patterns that we've been carrying along for a generation. Some stuff might be from our grandparents or great-grandparents, but if we can release that, like, our children don't have to carry that burden over, I guess. So how important is it to do our individual work, and how do you think we can change the society that we're living in by doing the individual work ourselves? How does that then affect the wider system and ripple out into the greater consciousness? Because at the end of the day, it's like, if I'm doing the work, and everybody who's been through, therapy or coaching or anything related probably has had those experiences of, when I'm doing work on myself, it actually ripples out into my family and into people that are around me. And it also affects them, which is really beautiful. So they don't actually even need to do the work. I'm doing it. I'm almost doing it for them, to a degree. But yeah, so how do you think that our individual work affects that wider system, and how plays into the greater consciousness?
Yeah, good question. So first thing that comes up is the more authentic, true, and real we are with ourselves and in the world, in interaction and relationship with the world, the more people are going to see that, and the more they actually have permission to do that themselves. The less fakeness, so to speak, is happening, that's going to sort of evoke as well, or like continue on creating. Because, yeah, I can go very deep on this, because we are no different to other people. Like, it might seem that there's a separation, which is a product of the ego construct. So there's an idea of a self here and an idea of another there. And the self here is subjective and the other there is objective. So we see other people as objects in the world almost, but we are also subjective there. We are that. So it's happening on a very, very deep, we can call it unconscious, but just a deep energetic level that we're not even really aware of that is happening. So the more true we are with ourselves, the more love is shining through here, the more love is experienced here, the more love is seen in the world out from here. Because there's more love in here, there's going to be more love seen out in the world. The more love is also going to be manifested in this world. It's almost like sort of on a quantum level, but it goes a bit deeper than that. But we can see it like that. And then on a more practical level, simply if we take the children as an example again, if a child is playing on the beach with the sand, right? And it's like the hands are all in the sand and the whole little body is all completely covered with sand. And then the mom comes along and says, oh, no, what have you done? Blah, blah, blah. And it starts to clean the sand from the baby off in a very sort of hysterical way. Then the child, all of a sudden, there was nothing. There was just sand. And all of a sudden there's something. There's a problem, or there is a something. Whilst before there was nothing. If there's a mom that comes in and just like, let's clean the sand in a very chill, easy way, puts off the child a bit, child doesn't know there's anything. There's still nothing. The more there is a something, the more there are some things out of reactive reactions, the more children are going to interpret that, the more conditioning is going to happen. And with the more conditioning, the density, the thickness of the ego construct is just simply thicker, and the less love is actually able to shine through. Because we are reclaiming, we are recovering, we are coming back to love. And that is what we essentially are. And that is, in my eyes, from my perspective, the ripple effect in the world for ourselves in a way, because the work in this location is no different to the work in that location, because the only thing that differences is the location where we are standing from, in a way. And we're deeply, deeply, deeply connected beyond human cognitive ideas about that, beyond human thought about that, of like, okay, I'm connected because I can breathe in the same air as you are. True, right? It goes a bit deeper than that. So it's such an energetic thing beyond our understanding that I do honestly, the inner work is the way to go, in my perspective, for global collective change. Yeah.
And it's interesting because anybody who's done, energy work or energy healing or anything along the lines of that will know that you don't necessarily need to be in the same place as the person that you're doing it with, right? It can travel, which is really beautiful. So that's what you've just said really nicely as well. So when we're looking at the individual work that people are doing, and when we're looking at the coachings that you are doing, do you see a lot of similar issues that people are coming with, or is it very different problems, that people do have? And I guess the question that I'm asking that is because we do live our life in a very interesting way these days. It's very busy, it's full on, lots of people are stressed, and everything has to be like more and faster and better and this and that. And I just wonder if like the way we're living our life is a representation of the problems that are coming up through that.
Yeah, so I definitely think that in terms of the speed of which everything is going now and the global connection that we have through internet and through a click on the phone, we've basically got the whole world of information and things right in front of us. We're never bored anymore. We can distract ourselves with so many different things, and that's what a lot of people also do. So there is lots happening for people. And I think that's definitely one of the reasons that the people are experiencing things like overwhelm and stress. And that is definitely also what I'm seeing in the coaching. It is still individual for each person. Like there's always different perspectives or different ways of working or different meaning structures around it, what that means for someone. Someone might feel that they need security in an environment, and that's causes stress, while someone else wants to perform at the highest level, which causes stress. And like there are different reasons for different people, but often we don't go that much into the content because it's just not that interesting. Everyone has different conditioning, and it's just not interesting to look at all the conditioning and go into sort of a maze within all of the conditioning that might be useful at some stage. And it definitely happens in the beginning of the coaching process. But as integral coaches, and what we also do with TSN and what I'm also doing in the coaching is very contextually based. So it's simply looking at what is the thought. Like I said in the beginning of this recording of this podcast, was that how the thoughts that we're having are not actual feelings. And the thinking that we have about our feelings are not the actual feelings. And that's the content of that might look different for different people, but the process is exactly the same in the sense of it is simply not identifying and not getting caught up within the content of the stories, because the content is the very thing that keeps it alive in a way. So the content is the story, and the content is the distraction of what is true and real and already happening for all of us. So we're clearing through the content, and we're clearing through the meaning making and the meaning structures, which looks different for everyone. But yeah, good question.
So when you do the coachings with people, what would you say are some of the biggest learnings that people are taking away from the work with you? What changes for them?
So everything changes for them. It really depends on where someone is at in the coaching process with me. So if someone just steps in, the biggest learnings might be very insightful ideas around stress is completely my experience of a situation, and no one else or no other situation can actually stress me out. That is completely my interpretation of that part of reality, of that part of the moment. And then there are people that are further into the coaching process, and they are really working on the subtle conditioning, and we're working way more energetically. And it's about realization within themselves, as we can call it God or Buddha or the universe, whatever we want to call it. But that's what we're ultimately sort of working towards, or clearing towards more so, because it's already happening for all of us, including the people that are just starting the coaching process or have never done any sort of thing like that, is the clearing back in a way to what is originally already true about us. And we're clearing deeper into the sources of that. But just to speak to that, one big realization that people have is that everything that takes us away out of the moment, the here and now, is a distraction, and is also not true. Is an illusion in a way. It's an illusory story. And it is every memory that we bring into this moment is a part of the construct, is part of the ego construct. And every future idea, every future thought we have about something that might happen in the future is a part of the construct. And it's not actually existing right now. It's only existing in our head. So it's not actually true right now. It's only existing in our mind. And that is what keeps it alive. And that is that ego construct. It is such a distraction for people. And that is such a big realization. The relationship with the moment is what is very, very real in this moment. Almost one of the highest truths in that sense. And that is a big realization for people. But yeah, to realize that there's other realizations prior to that, which probably is another big realization prior to that, might be that my perspective is my perspective, and it's simply not. It's a subjective experience. It's not true, and it's not the way reality is as in its truth. So that is a deep realization for people as well, that their beliefs, their values, their memories, their decisions, that it's all subjective experience. It's not out here in reality. It's all subjective. So yeah.
It's a very complex construct, but I think it's also very beautiful once you really get into it and once you really realize that, because even though it comes with a little bit more self-reflection and you need to take self-responsibility as well, it also gives you power, it also gives you the power to change things on your own and make changes in your own life that you would like to see.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's definitely a journey into a process into more freedom and more power, really, because the more we are influenced by the outside world, the more we give our power away in a way. And whether that is other people or a particular situation or this or that, whatever it is, but the more the power is out there rather than in here. So yeah, for sure. That's definitely a big part of it.
I think that's a beautiful way to end this conversation, because it's a very powerful message that you're giving there. And yeah, one that if you can really inherit that and make that part of your own, I think that can really, like you said, free people up on their paths, and free people up to live the life that they really want to live. Sara, before we finish the podcast, I just wanted to really briefly talk about Yes and. You are a part of a collective of coaches which works under the umbrella of Yes and once a year you put on the Yes and Festival, which is both an in-person as well as a virtual festival. Just tell us really briefly, what is the mission behind it? What are you trying to achieve with it? And how can people get involved with your beautiful community that you're building up there?
Yeah. So the Yes and Festival is a yearly festival. Like you said already, our vision with this festival is really to wake and grow as many people up as possible to what is possible for us on this planet as a collective. And how can people get involved? We're on Instagram, yes_and_co. And that's, if you want to be in touch, we're working with lots of other people, lots of other companies. We're really working on this interconnected network ourselves as well. So if you want to get in touch and you think I might be able to speak to a certain topic for next year, or I just want to help out with the organization, we're always looking for people to join us. The point of all of this is that we do it as a collective. So whoever is just inspired by what we do and our vision and what we stand for can reach out, and then we can see what's possible from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Sara. So looking at the 3 pieces of wisdom that came out of today's chat, there was so much knowledge and wisdom in this. So it's really hard to pick 3 out. But I think the 3 that stood out for me the most were, at the beginning, we were talking about challenges versus opportunities and how sometimes life just unfortunately does give you lemons, but what are you going to make out of it? How can you learn and develop so that you can get out of more difficult phases faster, and how you can then see things that life is throwing at you as opportunities and taking the positive things out of it. I think that would be my first learning. The second one would be looking at the stages of consciousness by Ken Wilber and looking at where we are in the world right now and the difference between, growing up and waking up, and where we are in the world right now and what we need to do in order to get to those next stages. How we need to shift our perspective and our doing and everything around it in order to be able to make those next steps in our personal evolution, I guess, and how that's different for everybody. So how we can shift our potential and how that's different for every individual. And the third piece of wisdom would be what you were just talking about at the end, in terms of that we only have this moment, and that everything that comes, everything that we're thinking about from the past or from the future is a construct that's not really happening. So the more we can learn to live in the moment and make the most of what we have right now, the more of a fulfilled life we'll be able to live. Awesome. Well, Sara, it's been honestly an absolute pleasure to have you on this podcast today. I could be talking to you for hours. We've talked for a really long time already. And what people haven't heard, I guess, is we've already talked in between about other topics that we could make whole episodes out of because we couldn't fit them in here anymore. But it is such a complex topic. And I mean, it's more than one topic, I guess, but it's so complex and there's so much more to be uncovered. And I've just honestly enjoyed our conversation so much. I've learned so much from it. And thank you so much for bringing all your wisdom and your knowledge into this space for everybody else as well to listen to.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun. And we went into a lot of rabbit holes for sure. And I'm sure we will find ourselves in a lot of rabbit holes in the future as well. It's just such a incredibly fascinating, just consciousness is so fascinating and so in depth. So it was really awesome to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me. And I think you've got such a wealth of knowledge in this space and you are truly a beautiful person inside and out. And I hope this was only one of many future chats that we are going to be having because I enjoyed every minute of it.
Me too. Thank you so much. It was really, really cool to be here and to talk about all of this with you. Yeah.
Thanks, Sara. So we've mentioned a few books today in the podcast. We've also talked a lot about Ken Wilber's stages of consciousness. So we'll put a few links into the podcast notes so that people can find those resources, because there is a lot of information there, and I'm sure some will want to dive deeper into that. And so we link that in the podcast notes. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. I really hope you got something out of this conversation today. I think Sarah and me went really, really deep on a lot of really complex topics today. So I hope you can take whatever feels right for you and put it in your little backpack of life and take it along on your journey. Please do share the podcast with your family, with your friends, or with anybody who you think might be interested in this information and who wants to dive deeper into those topics. I think the more we can spread the work around that, the better. And I really think it's such important work moving forward in this world. Before we end this episode today, we haven't talked about that at all, but Sarah is actually also an artist and a poet, and I absolutely adore her work. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and I would just like to end this episode with a really short poem from her. And then it happens, unexpectedly, when all layers are seen and seen through, we turn around and see truth. With those words, I would like to end the podcast today. I really hope this episode brought some sunshine to your soul. I'm sending lots of love and light your way, and until next time.